Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Today we will present about style of prose. So this is the member. A very large number of loosely descriptive terms have been used to characterize kind of style such as pure, ornate, florid, gay, sober, simple, elaborate, and so on. Styles are classified according to a literary period or tradition, according to an influential text, according to an institutional use, or according to the distinctive practice of an individual author. Style. There are 5 kind of periods. Number 1, Romanticism. Number 2, Realism. Number 3, Naturalism. Number 4, Impressionism. And number 5, Expressionism. Romanticism. Romanticism was a literary movement that began in the late 18th century, ending around in the middle of 19th century, although its influence continues to this day. Romanticism refers to a movement in art, literature, and music. Romanticism was considered idealistic, a belief in greater ideals than materialism and rationalism, and the potential beauty of nature and mystical experience. The imagination of many Romantic period writers was preoccupied with revolution, and from that fact and idea they derived the framework that enabled them to think of themselves as inhabiting a distinctive period in history. Okay, there are 3 characteristics of Romanticism. First, celebration of nature. Its main Romanticism writers explore the beauty of nature and they interpret their opinion to the event of nature. Second, focus on the individual and spirituality. Its main Romanticism writers are individual. And third, romantic love. Its main characters in Romantic period story and poems experience deep, emotional, passionate love. They don't want to marry because they think if they are married, it makes them unhappy.
I'm going to tell you about the Romanticism author. The first one that we see, Johann Wolfgang von Goethe. He is German poet, playwright, and author. His work is the sorrows of young reader that influence in creating an ideal of passionate and sensitive main character. Sir Walter Scott. He is Scottish historical novelist, playwright, and poet. His novel gained a global appeal, and he is an important romantic novelist in his period. And then Mary Shelley. She is English novelist, short story writer, dramatist, essayist, and travel writer. She wrote Frankenstein, and Shelley was a political radical that expressed more support for greater social cooperation than typical of more individualistic romantic. And the next, Honor de Balzac. He is French novelist and short story writer. In his period, he is an influential realist writer who creates character of moral ambiguity. He often makes a work based on his own real life. And his greatest work is the collection of short stories La Comédie Humaine. And then Alexander Dumas. He is an author of historical dramas such as The Count of Monte Cristo, The Three Musketeers, and the Marie Antoinette romances. Dumas was a larger-than-life character and influential writer. Next is Victor Hugo. He is the greatest French author in his period. And his example of his novel are Les Miserables and Notre Dame de Paris. And in his period, he became a leading Republican. And the next, Gustave Flaubert. He is influential French writer like Hono de Balza. But he is best known for his novel is Madame Bovary. And then Edgar Allan Poe, he is American poet and author. He is considered an influential member of the American Romantic movement. He usually wrote fiction, poetry, essay, and literary criticism. And then Walt Whitman, he also American poet like Edgar Allan Poe, but he would live of grass that groundbreaking new style of poetry. He was a bridge between the movement of transcendentalism and realism. And the last one is Emily Dickinson. In here, she is American female poet and lead secluded lifestyle and left a legacy of many short vivid poems, often on themes of death and immortality. And the next one, I'm going to explain about realism. So in here, realism is literary movement that occurred in 19th century in France. Realism focused on giving a view of what was occurring at the time and providing insight into what was really going on in society. And the writer that used realism usually as a technique to describe elements of literature such as intrinsic element and extrinsic element. Realist writer wants to portray life as it actually was, while Romanticism writer wanted to make the story about extraordinary people living in exotic places. And then the purpose of using realism is to emphasize the reality and morality that is usually relativistic and intrinsic for the people as well as the society. This sort This sort of realism make the reader face reality as it happens in the world, rather than in make-believe world of fantasy.
The characteristics of realism: a literary movement that focused on feeling, imagination, and intuition. Realism usually describes about life and society, focuses mainly on present issues and truths from now rather than the past or fantasy, focuses on the character's class rather than the actual plot. Diction is natural, it means they are talking and make a conversation with fact. So these are some authors from realism. The first one is de Balzac-Honoré, 1799 until 1850. Second, Dostoevsky, Fyodor, 1821 until 1881. Third, Eliot George, 1819 until 1880. Fourth, Flaubert Gustave, 1821 until 1880. Fifth, Howells William Jane, 1837 until 1920. Sixth, James Henry, 1843 until 1916. Seventh, Twain Mark, 1835 until 1910. Last is Wharton Edith, 1862 until 1937. Naturalism was first proposed and formulated by Émile Zola, the French writer and theorist who is universally labeled as the founder of literary naturalism. Naturalism was a literary movement in late 19th and early 20th century in France. It was inspired by adaptation of the principles and methods of natural science, especially the Darwinian view of nature, to literature and art. It extended the tradition of realism, aiming at an even more faithful and selective representation of reality, a veritable slice of life presented without moral judgment. Naturalism differed with realism in the assumption of scientific determinism, which leads to naturalistic authors to emphasize man's accidental physiological nature rather than his moral or rational qualities. The dominant theme of naturalist literature is that persons are fated to whatever station in life their heredity, environment, and social conditions prepare them for. The power of primitive emotions to negate human reason was also a recurring element. At first, social conditions are taken as a matter of fact. The documentary style of narrative makes no comment on the situation, and there is no sense of advocating for change. The naturalist simply takes the world as it is, for good or bad. Naturalistic works expose dark sides of life such as prejudice, racism, poverty, prostitution, filth, and disease.
Next characteristic of naturalism. First, determinism. Determinism is basically the opposite of the notion of free will. For determinism, the idea that individual characters have a direct influence of the course of their lives is supplanted by a focus on nature or fate. Human beings are living in a natural environment like animals. Objectivism. The author often tries to maintain a tone that will be experienced as objective. The author presents himself or herself as an objective observer similar to a scientist taking note of what he or she sees. This puts the focus more on the plot and what happens to the character, rather than the characters themselves. Pessimism. Very often one or more characters will continue to repeat one line or phrase that tends to have a pessimistic connotation, sometimes emphasizing the inevitability of death. Naturalistic works often include unquote or sordid subject matter. Next, naturalism authors. Émile Zola, French author of many works influential in the naturalism literary school, including his series of 20 novels, written between 1871 and 1893, that follow the Rogan maker family, starting with the fortune of the Rogans 1871. Theodore Dreiser. Theodore was one of the outstanding American writers of naturalism. He was the leading figure in a national literary movement that replaced the observance of Victorian notions of propriety with the unflinching presentation of real-life subject matter. Jack London. Jack London was one of the most popular American writers of his time and regarded as one of the greatest naturalist novelists of America. He has been in the forefront of the move toward naturalistic fiction and realism in America. Hemingway. Hemingway was also one of the outstanding American writers with naturalistic tendency. He was known as what Gertrude Stein had called a lost generation. Hemingway had rejected the romantic ideal of the ultimate unity of lovers, suggesting instead that all relationships must end in death. Stephen Crane. Stephen Crane was not a successful writer right away. His first novel, Maggie, A Girl of the Streets, A Story of New York, was not successful. After college, Crane wrote sketches and short stories for the Great Beach of Courage. James Crane almost instant fame. The Open Boat is said to be Crane's best work. Next, the differences between realism and naturalism. The term naturalism describes a type of literature that attempts to apply scientific principles of objectivity and detachment to its study of human beings, unlike realism, which focuses on literary techniques. Naturalism implies a philosophical position for naturalistic writers, since human beings are, in Émile Zola's phrase, human-based. Characters can be studied through the relation to their surroundings.
The next is the Impressionism. Impressionism is a literary or artistic style that occurred in the 19th century and the early 20th century in France. The term derived from the Claude Monet's paintings, Impression, Soleil Levant, that was exhibited in Paris in 1874. Borrowing the term from painting, Brunetière in 1883 is the first to apply it to the literature. Impressionists prefer to capture a feeling or experience rather than to depict accurate depiction and perfection. In Impressionist painting, they include relatively small, thin, yet visible brushstrokes, ordinary subject matter, unusual visual angles, and they always against the rule of academic painting. In Impressionism literary, it's the term to describe the novelist technique of the concentrating of the inner life of the main character, rather than on the external reality. So the Impressionists aim to represent the world as it is actually perceived. And they believe that reality lies in transient sensation and subjective perception. The Impressionist literature and paintings both share some basic characteristics. They are both interested in subjectivity of perception, with the emphasis on the point of view that can make a momentary effect, and plot lost its overall importance, because the Impressionists gave more importance to the freedom and also the informality to give the impression of actual lived reality. Although painting dominated all the other arts in the year 1875 until 1885, Impressionism in literature developed its own style and techniques. Peter Childs said that in the writing style of Conrad and Ford follow a similar pattern as the Impressionist painting, and lead to a fuller development of the narrative, but not all literary Impressionism can be explained by the influence of painting. So that's why there are some characteristics of Impressionism in literature. The first is the hallmarks of the Impressionistic literature are the narrative style and ambiguous meaning, because the author freed the reader to have more scope to think, judge, and conclude, rather than depending upon him. Second is they often describe the action through the eyes of the character while the events are occurring, rather than providing minute detail. The third is they are concerned with the emotional landscape of setting. They always want to sketch such a natural background when natural phenomena look pale and weird at the time of suffering and agony of the characters. The fourth is it's difficult to see a clear picture of events if you focus on the detail too closely. If the reader stand back from a novel for a while, they will get the full picture. The last is they often avoid chronological tellings of events. They give information in a way that forces the reader to focus on how and why things happen, rather than on the order in which they occur. So there are some examples from the Impressionist painting. From the left side is the Claude Monet's painting that is Impression Soleil Levant, while on the right side is the Pierre-Auguste Renoir that is L'Ancien of the Bohème Party.
There are some other of Impressionists. Joseph Conrad, his work Heart of Darkness, 1899. James Joy, his work Ulysses, 1922. Henry James, The Portrait of a Lady, 1881.
Expressionism. Expressionism is often considered a revolt against realism and naturalism, seeking to achieve a physiological or spiritual reality rather than record external events in logical sequence. As a literary theory, as a sharing with other movements around the turn of the century. The problem that faced the expressionism is twofold. They must not merely define the true nature of life as infinite, but he must also find the means of expressionist it in finite terms. The duality which we find inherent in the theoretical formulations of expressionism, namely of transcendence and immanence, gives to expressionist art a special task. It must resolve this implicate duality. In a prose, the early stories and the novels of Alfred Dublin were influenced by expressionism, and Franz Kafka is sometimes labeled an expressionist.
There are some authors of expressionists. Franz Kafka, 1883 until 1924. His work, The Metamorphosis, 1915, The Trial, 1925, The Castle, 1926. Author Franz Kafka explored the human struggle for understanding and security in his novels such as America, The Trial and the Castle, born on July 3, 1883, in Prague, capital of what is now the Czech Republic. Writer Franz Kafka grew up in an upper-middle-class Jewish family. After studying law at the University of Prague, he worked in insurance and wrote in the evening. In 1923, he moved to Berlin to focus on writing. But died of the tuberculosis shortly after. His friend Max Brod published most of his work posthumously, such as America and the Castle. His most popular and best-selling short story, The Metamorphosis, was completed in 1912 and published in 1915. The second author, Alfred Dublin, 1878 until 1957. His work, Berlin Alexanderplatz, 1929. Federico Garcia Lorca, 1898 until 1936. His work, Gypsy Ballads, 1928. George Kaiser, 1878 until 1945. His work, The Citizen of College, 1917, and From Morn to Midnight, 1917. Eugene O'Neill, 1888 until 1953. His work, Beyond the Horizon, 1920. The Great God Brown, 1926. Desire Under the Elms, 1924. The Iceman Comet, 1939, and Long Day's Journey into Night, 1939 until 1941. August Strindberg, 1849 until 1912. His work, The Road to Damascus, 1898 until 1904. The Dream Play, 1901, and The Goose Sonata, 1907.
So here are the sources that we use to writing this PowerPoint. This is the PowerPoint template that we use.